I'm Frank Schubert, and what we're going to talk about today are kind of several different, I've broken it out into several different sections. First is, from my perspective, understanding what makes for effective messaging. Talk about how to develop messaging. Review what the research shows on several pro-family issues that are prominently in the news. And then leave it open for discussion so that you all can contribute your own ideas on messaging or ask questions, whatever you'd like to do. A little bit about my background. I've been in public affairs for quite a while. My first campaign was in 1978, so you can do the math. I have had a public affairs firm for many years. I've twice been named the nation's top political consultant by there's actually an association of political consultants, believe it or not. And I was honored to win that award twice. I've managed 44 statewide issue campaigns across the country, winning most of them. And then in 2012, I suppose most people know me for my work on Proposition 8 in California. I ran the campaign for Prop 8, the successful one, stolen by the Supreme Court, but nonetheless, very proud of that work. And since 2012, I formed this company called Mission Public Affairs, and I focus my work now on marriage, life, and disability issues. So that's a little bit about me. There are a number of things that, when you're thinking about messaging, that I would recommend you try to focus on. First is develop messaging that's clear and easily understood, that it's persuasive, that is memorable, credible, and that makes a connection with the audience. And that last point is among the most important ones. Messaging has to resonate. It has to matter to people. It has to connect with them on an emotional level if it's going to be effective. If you're going to persuade people, you are going to, especially on the issues that we tend to work on, you're going to really need to connect with them at some deep level. In my opinion, pro-family messaging tends to be very complicated. It tends to be full of facts. It tends to be dry and generally lacking in emotion. It tends to be focused on groups and society, and it tends to be tied to the past.
What do you mean focused on groups and society?
In other words, messaging that relates to impact on a particular group of people or just society as a whole, as opposed to impacts on individuals. You see what I mean? Conversely, yes.
Sorry, I just tried. Could I just ask a quick research? Is this,
yeah.
Are the slides available afterwards? Can you email them?
I can email them, sure. Yeah, just let me know.
Just to save us writing.
Yeah, you bet. The messaging that I see from our opponents tends to be much simpler, much more emotion-based, culture appealing, much more individualistic. It's about me as opposed to someone else. And it tends to be more forward and future-looking. So you see the difference just in the way that the two sides tend to approach messaging. At least that's my view of it. Let me give you some examples of the other sides. Love is love. My body, my choice. Death with dignity. Dreamer. All of these are kind of aspirational statements. Very short. They resonate. People say, "Oh yeah, I get that." And the other side is very good with that. And there's lots of bumper sticker messaging that the other side uses, and ours tends to be longer and more complicated. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any ideas of messages that we should use that follow your rules?
I'm get to some of them. One of the things that I think we need to do a much better job of in the whole pro-family community is using stories. Stories are hugely important. This is what people connect to. They create that sense of connection. They understand it. Emotion will very often trump facts. And I'm not arguing here, don't misunderstand me, I'm not arguing that we have a lack of facts in a campaign. the messaging's not based on solid facts. I'm saying that the best messaging is when facts are delivered with emotion. Here in the U.S., many people have heard of the McDonald's coffee case. It's happened years and years ago, 20 years ago probably. And even to this day, it's the classic case that describes frivolous lawsuits. When you ask people, give me an example of a frivolous lawsuit, you're going to hear the McDonald's coffee case over and over again. If you're not familiar with it, somebody bought hot coffee at McDonald's, spilled it, got burned because coffee's hot, and sued McDonald's. Now, of course, the plaintiffs say there's a lot more to it, but nonetheless, that is an example of a story being used to help kind of define a whole genre of messaging. There's a growing influence, which I suspect all of you have experienced at some point, in the use of message shaming, what I call. What I mean by that is opponents are no longer really interested in a debate or in being tolerant of the other side. They're much more interested in shaming people, defaming them, trying to shut down debate, trying to move people to the margins of society. This is particularly true on the marriage issue right now, where the allegation is that this is a settled issue with the Supreme Court's ruling. No point in talking about it. Get over it, move on. If you don't go along, then you must be a hater. There's something wrong with you. You don't even deserve a seat at the table for a discussion. Social media, of course, contributes vastly to that phenomenon, and the intent is to silence the church and to move our side to the margins. I think this can be, well, here's an example. There's a whole group called No Hate. They've got their own logo. I should have put it on here. And there's a group called the Flying Monkeys. Has anybody heard of the Flying Monkeys?
Yeah.
Flying Monkeys are a group of gay activists. They meet and work through social media, and they move en masse to influence things. Comments on articles. The most recent example of it was directed at Ryan Anderson, who wrote the book called Truth Overruled about the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling on marriage. Amazon, as you all know, is a huge source of information on books, and you can rate and review books at Amazon. So the Flying Monkeys, because Ryan's book was being very favorably reviewed, even by people who don't agree with him on the subject, they thought it was a very well laid out case. If you haven't bought the book, you should do that. So the Flying Monkeys got engaged, and they just hammered the review site with one-star reviews and just horrible, nasty comments about Ryan. And the Daily Signal that the Heritage Foundation publishes was able to actually track down internal messaging among the group about, you know, fly monkeys fly and that kind of a thing. So that's an example of shaming, and it's an ongoing phenomenon. So how do we combat this? Well, the first thing that's critically important is that our side define the terms. We have to define what the terms of the debate are. And we have to challenge our opponent's use of language and co-opt their language in many cases. We can't be, we shouldn't be talking about, you know, concepts that are not resonating. We shouldn't allow the other side to, you know, to co-opt terms. You know, they're all in favor of choice, for example, when it comes to abortion. But they're not in favor of choice when it comes to a parent who has a gay kid and they'd like to have a professional work with that child. That choice should be off the table. Well, we shouldn't let them get away with that position. All right, here's an example. Love is love. Well, I mean, when you think about it, love is not love. There are many types of love. Love is a complicated thing, but it's a sweet-sounding statement, and it does tend to resonate at first blush with people. But I say love is truth. So if love is truth, then you love someone when you speak the truth to them, when you teach them. That's not hate, that's love. And truthful is love. So Love is truth. We've got on the left here the equal sign, and on the right the ampersand. Relationships are not, they are based on man and woman, husband and wife, mother and father. So we can talk about those, I mean, we can talk about terms like diversity. Contributes to a flourishing society, diverse in relationships as well. All right, so I'm going to move through some of these mechanics fairly quickly, but just want to cover some of the elements of how you develop effective messaging. And the first few are ones that are very frequently overlooked. First is issue research. Before you begin to lay out what your message plan is going to be, how you're going to move people from one point to another, you really have to become an expert in the issue. You need to study it, understand it, and be able to articulate basic facts about it. You need to do opposition research, understand where your opponent is, why they say the things they do, why they believe the things that they do. What is it that motivates them? What are they trying to accomplish? Comparative research, by that I mean taking a look and comparing other types of campaigns that you may be engaged in, either on the particular issue or on something similar, and how do those things play out. Audience research is another critically important tool. Messaging for the public might be much different than messaging, say, for a legislative body. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. Impact research, by that I mean how are people impacted by the particular issue? Yes.
That audience research is really valuable, and you said there's a difference between the public and the legislature.
Yes.
In Utah, there's even a difference between the two houses. How we'll present something to the House is different than how we'll present something to the Senate.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. And then the two broad tools that are out there, or methodologies I should say, are qualitative research and then quantitative research. We'll get into that in a little bit. So, as I said, on the issue research, many people on our side don't do this because it can require some expenditure of funds, which are precious. But you really need to spend time working with the experts in the community and really understand this stuff. If you're going to be working, for example, on, I don't know, physician-assisted suicide, as an example. Spend time with medical experts. Spend time with people who have gone through terminal illness or are going through terminal illness. Spend time with the grief counselor. Spend time with hospice. Understand how these things actually play out in the real world. You may want to engage some of these experts to be part of your team, and you should budget for it. It's not a superfluous expenditure, because everything you're going to talk about is going to flow from your understanding of the issue. So invest in your understanding. Yes, ma'am.
Qualitative and quantitative. When I was working on my degree, it's much easier to fudge your results with qualitative. You've got
Sure.
just a few people.
Right.
With quantitative, you've got to have at least 30 people to be able to say anything. With qualitative, I saw people just take sample sizes of 8 or 10 and get these huge outcomes. And it was all just a few people,
Right.
what they were saying. So I think we need to weigh the value of the research that we're looking at, and
Right.
is there a decent sample
And
size?
I'm going to get into all of that in terms of how you would consider going about it yourself to make sure it's valuable. But you're right. One of the great studies. I was in the speakers room a while ago, and there was the panel, which I imagine you all attended, with various experts on family structure. I'm going to talk a little bit about family structure in my presentation, but almost all, if not all, of the studies that purport to show that there's no difference for children raised in alternative family structures, especially raised by gays and lesbians, almost all of them are small sample, convenient sample, people who have an interest in the outcome of the research. And not surprisingly, they show this no difference. In some cases, they claim that it's better for kids to be raised by lesbian and gay parents. Now, before I get any further on this, I just want to make it crystal clear, and we'll talk about this. When I compare outcomes, I'm not saying that gays and lesbians are not good parents. I'm not saying that they don't love their children. I'm saying that family structure matters greatly, hugely, for outcomes for kids. The love of a mother and a father are complementary and essential. That's my point. All right, we'll come back to some of that later. In opposition research, the main thing, and this is hard to do, but you really have to try objectively to put yourself in the head of your opponents, to really try to understand what's going on here. From their perspective, what do they want? What do they say? What do they do? Are there any points of agreement? Because you can oftentimes hinge a messaging track off of a point of agreement, but lead to a point of difference that the public agrees with you on. We talked about these comparative research things, a little bit more on audience research. There are lots of ways now through technology to understand how different audiences think. Understand what their characteristics are, how do they get information, what sorts of sources do they rely on, and identifying who your audiences are. And they're different. The way people react is different. Here in the U.S., as you know, we've got the presidential race next year. So, there's polls flying all around, they always do, and it's like, well, how can this be? One poll says this, the other says that, how can it be so far apart? And the answer is it has a lot to do with how the survey is put together. So a survey of adults is going to give you different results than a survey of voters. A survey of voters is likely to give you a different result than a survey of likely voters or likely primary voters. And in some cases, the universe is even narrower. So in Iowa, as if for instance, it's the first place in the country that voting will occur. It's called a caucus state. So what that means are people have to show up to a particular location and cast a ballot for their candidate. So there are 2.4 million adults in Iowa. There's 1.9 million active registered voters. Of those, 1.5 million actually voted in 2012. Of those, there's 615,000 registered Republicans, and of those, 121,000 people actually went to a caucus. That's 20% of the registered Republican universe, and it's 5% of the registered voter universe.
The caucus guys, you're talking about primaries here.
Yes, so this is a primary. So it's a caucus in the sense that they're selecting their nominee to come out of Iowa. So when you see a poll, and it's of Iowa adults or registered voters in Iowa, that's really meaningless because it's not registered voters. I mean, only 20% of those people are going to actually cast a ballot. So that's important to understand your audience. A little bit here, there's two different types of ways of segmenting your audience. One is by demographics, and those are really the who your audience is. Male, female, age range, educational attainment. Do they go to church? How often do they go to church? What's their religion? Do they consider themselves a Democrat or Republican? Are they registered to vote? Etc. And then there are psychographics. And psychographics are really more about characteristics and lifestyle and what these people do and why they do it. And there are increasing ways to help identify that. There's a group called I-360, which is essentially a faith-based or conservative-based voter database, and they have attributes on something like 180 million people in the United States. So, and where do they get these attributes? They get them from the tools of marketing, the commercial marketing. So if somebody subscribes to a gun magazine, or they're a member of the NRA, or they have donated to a Christian organization, or they're somehow been flagged as a pro-marriage person. All these types of data points are available, and I360 is constantly trying to integrate those into creating a profile. And so you may find out that the audience you need to reach to take a particular action is a real subset. Maybe it's evangelicals, maybe it's conservative Catholics, maybe it's somebody who owns 3 cars or has children in the primary grades. All this stuff you can begin to pull together. So it's a tool. It's not inexpensive, but it can be done. And many of the family policy council groups, if you're connected with them, have access to this data, as do some of the national pro-family groups. There's a type of campaigning, a type of messaging that's very effective, and I call it the right problem, wrong solution, or it depends type messaging. So what do I mean by that? Oftentimes you'll find out through your research work that you're not likely to be successful in persuading somebody to take an action or cast a vote through a head-on attack on the issue. For example, and I talked about this later, but the idea of physician-assisted suicide is quite popular in the United States. Almost 70% of people support physician-assisted suicide. So if your campaign is, and your messaging is, this is a terrible idea, it's horrible, it's immoral, we should not ever countenance this, anybody who supports physician-assisted suicide is a bad person, you're probably not going to be particularly successful. On the other hand, if you look at messaging that acknowledges the very real challenges that people have when they go through this, challenges for the patient who's got a terminal illness, challenges for the caregiver, challenges for the family, and you start there acknowledging that this is a serious problem, but that physician-assisted suicide is the wrong answer, and the particular proposal is flawed. I'll talk about how that played out in an actual campaign. That's an example of right problem, wrong solution messaging. Now, prior to Prop 8, I had never done any social issues. So all my work was on garden variety, business community issues, tobacco taxes, regulation of HMOs, healthcare reform, environmental policy. And this sort of technique came into play quite extensively in those types of campaigns. So twice well actually 3 times I defeated increased tobacco taxes in very liberal states. Because, and I didn't focus on, it's wrong to raise taxes on tobacco companies. I focused on how the money was being spent, and the mistakes that were being made, and the lack of accountability, and all these other issues. So that is something you should consider when you're developing your own messaging. Just because you're dealing with a seemingly impossible issue, and the public's very much on the other side of it, doesn't mean you can't still develop quite effective messaging and win. Another example is in the area of abortion. So from my home state of California, voters there are overwhelmingly pro-choice on abortion, overwhelmingly, 70+%. And yet they believe in exceptions such as parental notification. Parental notification tests in the upper 60s, almost as high as the pro-choice on abortion. But even with parental notification, they want some particular protections for unique circumstances. And so thus you'll see in a parental notification campaign a discussion about the child who has an abusive parent and what happens to her. And that becomes the focus of the other side's campaign. Again, it's just an example of this understanding the right solution, wrong solution approach. All right, so now to talk a little bit more about qualitative research. And so what do I mean by qualitative research? Qualitative research is a methodology that is designed to really delve into an issue in depth, to have a full-throated discussion with a small number of people, an in-depth discussion that allows you to go into the nuances. It's a tremendous tool to be able to examine how people react to the introduction of new information, how they react to something that somebody else has said, and just generally kind of define the universe, if you will. You can test messages in qualitative methodologies, and you should, but the limitation is that the small number of participants that are typically in them means that you're not going to be able to project the results over the whole population. So in a typical focus group, for example, there'll be 10 or 12 people, and you might do 2 of them a night. So you've got 20 people in a particular town, and then maybe you'll do another set of groups in another town. At the end of the process, maybe you've got 40, 60, 80 people. That's still a very small number of people. So you'll have a very good idea, though, when you go through a series of these things, how people are generally reacting. There are different types of qualitative research. The most common in public affairs are focus groups. One-on-one interviews are also very useful. There are facilities at shopping malls all across the country that have interview facilities set up called mall intercepts. They're very good for product testing in particular. Dyads and triads is an old phenomenon, but are being used more increasingly in public affairs stuff. It essentially means interviews with 2 people or 3 people. So you pair 2 people off and you see how they react. And 3 people, same thing. You get somebody who's more on your opponent's side, somebody more on your side, somebody in the middle, and you see how they react and what moves them. And then there are combinations, qualitative, quantitative hybrids, and the most common there would be in advertising testing. So in advertising testing, what I typically do is I'll have maybe 20, 25 people. They'll be in a room just like this. They'll have a dial. They'll see a draft commercial. They'll rate it according to various factors, and they'll dial their reaction, positive and negative, over the course of seeing the commercial. We'll do that a couple of times. So when it's all done, I can see how men behave, how women behave, what the age range differences are, and so forth. And then we'll break out into just a traditional focus group discussion. What did you like? What didn't you like? What stood out? What would you change? That kind of thing.
Frank, just in terms of getting the survey participants, it seems like our opposition go shopping for their recipients, so a lot of their research is qualitative. They try to argue it's quantitative, but it's actually qualitative, and they go shopping through message boards on their mates' websites.
Yeah.
So how do you guarantee that qualitative research has some benefit in terms of being a representative sample?
Well, from our perspective, I'm really talking about how would we go about developing our own messaging. And so the key elements in qualitative design is first participant selection and screening. So how are these people going to get into the room? Usually you pay someone, and the more random you can make it, the better. Now, a lot of focus group facilities have their own internal house list of people that they've screened, and that's fine. It's not my preferred way of doing it because you end up with kind of professional focus group attendees, and they say what they think you want them to say. A better way is to see if you can't find a list, and it's fairly easy in public affairs. You just get a list of voters in an area, and have them be called by the facility. You'll develop criteria. You know, and quotas. You only want a certain number of people in a certain age. You might want, you know, all of one gender, none of the other, or you might want a mix, depending on the issue. You might you'll screen out particular types of people, like somebody who works for an advertising agency or works, you know, in the news business. You don't want. I sometimes will screen out lawyers because I don't want them to be the group to defer to the lawyer to become the expert, right? So that oftentimes will happen is the lawyer will say, well, let me tell you how this really works. So you develop your screening criteria, you do the recruitment, you manage that process very closely. The second key is to really understand what is it that I want to get at, what are the issues I want to cover. And you develop a discussion guide based on that. And that's nothing more than an outline. And you try to take some educated guesses about time that you're going to spend on a particular subject. So one of the common problems in focus grouping is that you know, you'll start off with introductions and kind of a general, what are the issues, you know, in your community? Tell me the stuff that you guys are talking about with your friends and neighbors. And it's an important part because it begins to establish some rapport with the moderator and it loosens people up. But you know, sometimes it takes 10 or 15 minutes for the guy to get through it. You've only got, you know, 2 hours. So that's where a skilled moderator comes into play. And this is another area people try to cut. They say, well, I'll just moderate the groups myself, or you know, I'll get my communications director to do it. We'll save some money. We can do it cheap. Well, you know, you're going to get what you pay for. A skilled moderator is going to keep the direction moving, the discussion moving. He's going to probe, or she's going to probe on issues. She will have invested the time to understand what your objectives are, what you're trying to get at, and will look for nuances. And she will manage the participation of the people in the room. There's a phenomenon I call, most of the focus group rooms are set up with either a rectangle table with the moderator at the head of it, or an oval table, right? And there's typically microphones in the ceiling, and there's typically a glass behind it where you can sit and watch the thing unfold. And there's a phenomenon I call the alternate moderator. And this is the person who sits at the opposite head of the table. And almost invariably, this person is going to try and take control of the group. They're going to try and be, you know, the alternate moderator. And you have to be able to deal with that. Sometimes you get into a situation and despite all the screening criteria, you have somebody in the group who is directly connected to the issue that you're trying to study. And, you know, you don't want that. If I'm doing a group on assisted suicide, for example, I don't want a terminal patient in a general group because everybody in the group is going to defer to what the patient has to say. That will never be any useful information or discussion that's contrary to that point of view. So the moderator, you know, will try and generate that information and then arrange for the person to be excused from the group.
So Frank, you're saying that it's not a coincidence where that person sits at the other end of the table from the moderator.
No.
It might be one of the focus group participants who takes that seat because they're a dominant person.
Right, they're a dominant personality. That's very common. It's not always the case, but it's very common. And there's nothing wrong with that. Every group has a dominant personality in it. It's just like every herd does. But the moderator's job is to make sure that no one person controls the group.
So typically a dominant person sits at the end of the table, is what you're saying.
It's often that person, yeah. Often that person. Yes, ma'am.
Which is more important, to get people with all these different age groups, you know, try to get them to fit in the right holes, or just have a randomly selected group of people? And how should we, what weight should we give the various different forms of picking your people that you're analyzing?
Well, you know, to the extent you can, you want the people in the room to reflect the audience that you're trying to move. So, for example, I've done legislative projects before where we're trying to figure out how to position a particular bill. And so the people in the room would be folks like legislative staff, former staff, people who work for public policy organizations, people who are lobbyists, public relations people, that kind of thing. So you're going to get reaction from people who generally reflect the audience you're trying to influence. In a public affairs campaign, it may be voters, or it may be a particular type of voter. It just really depends. So then, once you've made that determination who you want, then you've got to find the best way to recruit them. Working from lists and using trained recruiting firms. So let's move to survey research, which is the primary form of quantitative research. So the advantage of a survey is that you're going to get reliable data. If it's done right, you're going to get reliable data. Data that you can depend on, that is true to a statistical degree of certainty. You're going to be able to look at data across different demographic groups and evaluate how messages, arguments, circumstances, scenarios measure up depending on the particular demographic that you're looking at. Men and women, Republicans, Democrats, different age ranges, and so forth. The disadvantage of a survey is you're only going to get answers to questions that you think to ask. And that's why I do focus groups first, because they help me identify kind of what the universe is. So that if something has emerged in the focus grouping process, I want to make sure I take a look at it in the survey. When you're faced with a choice of what do you rely on, you've got to make a strategic decision. And you've got focus group results that differ from the survey results, then you should rely on the survey results, because they're more people and more reliable. Focus groups can be misleading because of the small number. The typical type of survey work in a public affairs context, the first is called a conjoint analysis, and it's a fairly sophisticated research methodology that helps you make judgments about elements that you might want in a proposal. So, for example, if you had a proposal on raising taxes on insurance companies, you could evaluate whether it should be a 5% tax, 10% tax, 12% tax, and you'd be able to take a look at how that moves the other and isolate that particular variable. So that's what a conjoint analysis does. Very useful for if you're going to move forward with a legislative proposal or a ballot measure. The baseline survey or the benchmark survey is the seminal research document in any campaign. This is the document that you should spend the most amount of time on and the most amount of money on in your whole research program. It's going to give you a sense of how people, where people are on the issue generally. You're going to get a first ballot test, if you will, typically. You're going to measure, see how people react to arguments and positioning. You're going to see how the demographics react. You're going to get a second ballot test to see how people move. And you're going to be able to, from that document, be able to draft a campaign plan that lays out how you're going to win, how you're going to get from point A to point B. The second piece, the next piece that is very useful is what I call strategy refinement survey. So typically this will be done after the campaign has been progressing for some period of time, and it doesn't necessarily have to be progressing on the public airwaves, if you will. It can certainly be, if there's going to be a vote in November of 2016, for example, and I do my baseline survey now, I'm probably going to do a strategy refinement survey somewhere in the May-June period, right? So there's been a number of months of the two sides engaging in the media and social media and all the various audiences. And The refinement survey is simply lets me measure the impact of the other side's arguments if I didn't anticipate them previously. I can test them. If new things have come up, I can test those. And I can just make refinements. I also will tend to use that particular survey as an important point in time to measure movement in tracking, which is the final survey. So tracking surveys are not really designed to get into a great deal of depth of information. They're designed to give you an understanding of where things are moving, what's happening. And it's usually while advertising is being aired, okay? So in a hotly contested campaign, I'll do tracking 3 or 4 times a week. And we'll do 200 or 300 interviews a night, and I'll be able to keep on track. I'll know what's going on. Where are people moving? Are my messages getting through? So when you put all of this together and you integrate your research program, what you've done is you've become expert in the issue. You've understood it. You've explored these very broadly in focus groups. You know how people react. You have a good idea of how the discussion might play out. You've narrowed your arguments. You've tested your arguments. You've examined how your arguments can be executed in advertising or in other persuasion techniques. And you are monitoring how they're actually working once they're delivered. And that is the value of a research program. If you are not doing that in a hotly contested campaign, you're really flying blind. It's a lot of money. It's not an insignificant amount of money to do this. We probably spent $200,000 or more on research and propagate, maybe considerably more. It's a lot of money. But you know, there's a lot at stake. And we ultimately raised $40 million in that campaign. So an investment of $200,000 or $300,000 was quite worth it. And we wouldn't have raised the money if we hadn't done that, because we wouldn't have developed the campaign that we did, and we wouldn't have generated the confidence that people have in it. Now, in terms of designing a survey, just a couple of things. First, again, you know, this is not for the faint of heart. Don't think you can do this on your own. Don't try and do something on SurveyMonkey. Okay. I mean, this is serious stuff, and you should bring in the best people that you can afford to bring in. Hire independent researchers. That's first and foremost. Why? Well, because if you rely on your consultant to do the research, you have no way to challenge your consultant. You have no independent person who can push back against what the consultant is telling you. But if you have an independent researcher...
What do you mean by consultant?
Well, if you hire somebody like me, for example, to run a campaign...
To run a campaign.
To run the campaign.
Okay.
You should not hire me to... I don't do focus groups or surveys anyway, but you know, some people do. They say, oh, we'll do that all internally for you. No, don't do that. Hire an independent research firm and get the advantage of their take on things. So that's very important. Firms should be experienced in this type of work that you're doing. This should not be their first rodeo. The selection of the sample is very important as well. If it's a voter universe, you know, select the sample from the voter file. Don't just, you know, ask somebody, are you registered to vote, and assume that they are. There's a phenomenon in survey research that comes up a lot on family matters. It's called social desirability bias. So if you ask people, did you vote in the last presidential election? They're going to tell you yes. And you're going to get, you know, 90% will say yes, I voted. But only 75 or 80% actually voted. So somebody's lying right off the bat. Whereas if you use a list of actual voters, you know that they're actually registered to vote. They're able to cast a ballot in the particular race that you're interested in. So sample selection, very important. The interviewing process and the design of the questionnaire is also critically important, which is another reason why having an independent research firm is very helpful. it's very easy to inject bias into a survey. I have to work very, very hard not to do that. Sometimes I fail at it. And sometimes research firms intentionally bias things. Like, for example, the Gallup organization has been surveying on same-sex marriage for many, many years. And they do something that's called priming. They prime the marriage question by asking a question immediately prior to it that's designed to elicit favorable response for same-sex couples. And it's something to the effect of, do you think gay and lesbian relationships should be legal? And it should be legal or illegal? Well, it's an idiotic question because they've been legal for 30 years. There's no state in the country where it's illegal. You can have a relationship with whoever you want. So it's clearly designed to get people on the side of the gay couple, and then they ask about marriage, right? And so it's no surprise that Gallup is always way up there when you look at the result on the marriage question.
Isn't that a description of that technique, like push polling?
Push polling is a little bit different, but yes, I mean, bias is one thing. Push polling is designed to communicate consistently negative and consistently incorrect and biased information. And oftentimes, they're not actually conducting a poll, they're actually trying to persuade you with, so they do it in the guise of a poll. It's against the law to do that in most places, but it's a notorious part of the industry. All right, so let's go now to look at a review of some of the current pro-family research that's out there. So I have tried to, when we go through it, you'll see I've tried to put a source for all of the data that I'm mentioning. Some are surveys of adults, some are surveys of voters, some are likely voters. There's one slide that is the result of focus groups, so I'll mention that. So let's talk a little bit about religiosity, because this is one of the primary factors that will influence how somebody feels about a pro-family message. Do they believe in God? What role does God play in their life? Do they think that God had anything to do with a particular issue? Right now, 70% of Americans identify with some branch of Christianity, according to the Pew Research Center. This is down 8 points in the last 8 years. Church attendance is another critical factor. Of those people who are religious, who goes to church? Who's in the pews? Gallup says 40% of Americans attend church on any given Sunday. But that is overstated because of social desirability bias. Again, if somebody doesn't want to look bad. They say they're religious, you know, do you go to church? Yes. Yeah.
Would that also probably factor into the 8% reduction from the year 2007? People really weren't religious prior to that, but
They feel more comfortable
yeah,
saying
the shame
it could be.
factor's gone.
It could be. It could
And so
be.
they'll state that they aren't
Could very
religious.
well be. So there was a very large survey done in 2014 by the Austin Institute. It's called the Relationships in America Study. Yes, ma'am.
The church attendance question is one of those that's really hard because there are people who go to church every single week. There are people who go once a year, but they do go to church once a year. So how do you ask a question like that to really get a true picture of how much attendance there really is?
Yeah, so it would be something like, please tell me, do you go to church every week, more than once a week, a couple times a month, only on special occasions, or rarely or never?
So the Gallup number of 40%, is that?
That's the number when people tell them they attend once a week.
Okay.
That's once a week.
What's
So the Relationships in America study is a study of people age 60 or younger. And it's very large, the sample size is like 15,000. And they reported that 27% of Americans attend church.
What was the figure, Frank, on the number of believe dropped?
It's around 80%, higher in some places. You know, you can get into it. I don't know if I put this message on my slide or not, but one of the questions we've asked in the marriage battle is something to the effect of, you know, God is the author of marriage. You know, and we get high agreement with that, 67% agree with that. All right, the top attending faith, according to the Relationships in America study, are Mormons. Over 80% attend service every week. Next is Muslims. Evangelicals, next. Traditional Catholics, 58%. And then they break that out into moderate, liberal Catholics. The more liberal you get, the less you go to church. This is one of my big gripes as a practicing Catholic is, you know, you see these polls about what Catholics think. You know, 75% of them haven't seen the inside of a Catholic church, you know, since they were baptized. You know, they're no more Catholic than my cat is.
So across Catholics altogether, the percentage would be much less than 58%.
Yes, definitely.
So you're including liberal Catholics.
Yeah, I mean, they might be, you know, 25, 30%, 35%. Small, much smaller percentage. Let's talk a little bit about the life issue. First of all, some facts. 1% of women in America report having had an abortion due to rape. 1%. Less than 0.5% of women have had an abortion as a result of incest. Okay, so these are extraordinarily rare circumstances. Planned Parenthood, obviously in the news tremendously as a result of the video expose. 88% familiar with Planned Parenthood. 55%, only 55% are where they provide abortions. That is stunning to me, how effective Planned Parenthood has been at masking what their actual work product is. Only 15% know how massive they are.
If you polled now, that would be totally different because of profile and circumstance, wouldn't
It might be better.
you? You'd have to have your head in the clouds.
Yeah,
not
this
to
was
know.
prior to the expose.
So that's the importance of updating polling when significant events take place?
Sure, you bet, you bet. Of course, you know, this was done for a particular client in 2013, so it's the latest that I had on there. Oh, the public polling does still show high support for Planned Parenthood. And a complete misunderstanding of what it is that they do.
Can I just ask one question? Back on that 1% slide and the less than that one slide. I remember using that statistic in a conversation online with a group, a large group. And I used that statistic and their response was really interesting. They said, okay, but that's 1% of America. That's still like a lot of people, relatively speaking. And I was kind of like, oh, you know, it kind of stopped me in my tracks because that's true, but then I go back to, well, that's 99% that aren't, you know what I mean? It was just a little tricky.
Yeah, I mean, it's a way, I think, you know, to, if you're a candidate or working for a candidate who's a pro-life candidate, you know, every one of the pro-life candidates gets hammered with this rape and incest issue. They never are asked, the other side, the other candidates never ask, well, do you support having an abortion because you don't want boys, you only want girls, or you just want girls so you abort, or you just want boys so you abort girls?
Or when
And
the
push
right begins.
Push
They
them
have
to
ask
the,
them.
no, of course not. Yeah. All right, this,
question on that.
next two slides are more recent.
So,
Yes, ma'am.
was it 1% of American women Or 1%
people who had
of women who had
abortions.
abortions?
It was, I'd
That's a
have to
huge
go back and
difference.
look at it. It was the Guttmacher Institute.
That looks
Because
like a
it's
very
women who
large
have
number. That's a very, very large number.
Think of women who report having an abortion.
Okay, so they had 1% of
Of
abortions?
abortions
Yeah.
are
Seems
caused,
like a small number to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and less than 0.5% of women who have had an abortion
Okay.
was as a result of reasons. All right, so the next couple slides are contemporary to the crisis that Planned Parenthood is in. 60% are less favorable towards them, knowing that they've been caught in this undercover sting. The argument that they fail to report sexual abuse by girls reduces their popularity considerably. And also that their former directors report having abortion quotas. That is a big negative for them. 68% believe, this is of the state of Ohio, that taxpayers should not be paying for Planned Parenthood to harvest fetal parts. They agree that Congress should stop funding Planned Parenthood entirely. This is a public opinion strategy survey in Ohio for ADF. And they also did one in Iowa, very similar data.
Is that fairly consistent across states?
I've only seen it in the two, Iowa and Ohio. Some of the national data is a little bit less encouraging. Yes?
Is that saying that they changed their mind after, like, if they supported Planned Parenthood, then now they're like, oh, no, I guess they're bad?
Yes.
Because I don't know.
More
I have
inclined.
super liberal family members. My sister actually posted on Facebook that we should all send Planned Parenthood a thank you note for the services they provide for women. So I'm clear on the other end of the spectrum.
I think she's asking how much movement was there from pre-videos to post-videos.
Yeah, and that I don't have. I just have, in the survey, they asked, are you more favorable or less favorable towards Planned Parenthood? So it's just a tool to understand. It's just indicating that talking about that fact is an effective technique. All right, some other things on abortion. 64% support banning abortion after 20 weeks when the infant can feel pain. Many experts believe that. 85% support a ban on sex-selective abortions. Democratic candidates never get asked about these things, and they should. Our side should hammer them. Hammer them. They're really the ones with the extremist perspective here.
I have a question. Do you know if they actually, like, or do they allow questions from the general public, or do they tailor-make the questions?
Who's they?
So the people who are asking the questions of the candidates.
Well, like at a forum.
Mm-hmm.
It depends. A lot of times, if there's media involved, they'll try and select a mixed audience. If it's, if it's the candidate, they'll sometimes just want favorable people there. But, you could still get in and should ask them. So those are important findings. Now, in the U.S., about a little less than a third think that abortion should be legal under any circumstance. And 20% say it should be illegal in all circumstances. So there's a lot of people on the table here that are in the it depends category. That data, by the way, has been stable for a decade. Now, when you ask people, are you pro-life or pro-choice, it's fairly evenly split. The pro-choice position nationally has a lead of 6 points. That's been stable for a decade.
What is the other 6%?
They're not sure. Abortion, 45% of the country thinks abortion is morally acceptable. 45% say it's morally wrong. This data is trending towards the acceptable side. It's up 5 points in the last decade. Now, even though the country is pretty evenly split, and there's some evidence that young people are moving towards a pro-choice position, pro-life position, having worked on this issue, I can tell you that, though I can't quantify it, there's a lot of people on our side who say they're pro-life, and that means nothing. They will never vote a pro-life bill. They're not going to be with us on an initiative because they don't want to impose their position. They don't want to impose their viewpoint. But the other side, of course, can completely impose their point.
And on that, is it possible to come up with some messaging that says, that puts the people to change their paradigm on this? I don't want to place my views upon others. Right. Saying, compare this, that particular stance as, I wouldn't enslave a black myself, but I support the right of others to choose. Or I wouldn't send a Jew to the gas chamber myself, but I support the right of others to choose.
Well, I mean, my guess is that that probably is going to be offensive to people.
I imagine it would. It might shock them into their forward thinking.
Well, there's a big debate about what's the best way to go about moving the country. Yes, ma'am.
Do these statistics, and how does it work with the morning after Plan B, which do these statistics, is there any statistics about that in view of people's idea of abortion or pro-life?
I haven't seen it, but I would just assume that the numbers would be worse from our perspective. People don't understand the actual biological facts of Plan B. They think it is an abortion, but they don't see it that way.
Just on the issue of moral acceptability and the 29% and the 19% that were either for or against in all circumstances, is there much difference in the research or the polling on gender?
Yes, women are more pro-choice than men are, certainly, as a general matter, and there's a difference between age groups. One of the interesting things that's happening in this is that, in the sexual revolution, the rise of feminists in the 60s and 70s, contraception was a big deal. There were very few options, and having sex really meant risking getting pregnant. And this is what really drove the abortion issue, was because women wanted to have sex whenever they wanted, men wanted to have sex with the women, and sometimes this inconvenient development occurred, so they wanted to get rid of it. Now, contraception is widely available to young people. It's essentially free, very inexpensive. It's, they say at 1% failure rate, but it's much less than that. So young women increasingly are not getting the whole point here. They think abortion is mean. It's not inevitable that you need an abortion. If you have an abortion, it's because you screwed up, and it's not right to take it out on the fetus. And also the development of technology, like ultrasounds, has been hugely important.
So the shame of women is not greater for them. I mean, my experience from the few women that I know that have had them, that there is a real, they strongly feel it's not morally acceptable, and they're very cautious about who they tell and whatever. I mean,
once the procedure's been done, their life is forever changed, I can tell you that. All right, let me move, if I can, to marriage, something I spent a lot of time working on. A little bit about the Supreme Court's ruling. Right before the ruling, the Family Research Council had a company do a survey, WPA Research, good firm, and they found that 61% of voters were opposed to the Supreme Court imposing same-sex marriage. They did not want the court to do this. I've seen similar data at the state level all across the country. After the decision, the public opinion of the U.S. Supreme Court fell to an all-time low. In the history of this country, there have never been more unpopular. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, knucklehead, gave an interview before the decision, said if they were to redefine marriage, it'd be no big deal, had no impact. Well, it's not turned out to be the case. Of course, there is a split, as you would expect, between liberals and conservatives. But as a general rule, the country is very much opposed to what the Supreme Court did. And related to that, support for same-sex marriage has declined since the Obergefell ruling. You don't read that in the papers much, but that's the fact. This was a AP GFK survey in July, right after the decision. 39% supported the ruling, 41% opposed it. The support for same-sex marriage dropped from 48% to 42%. Opposition went up by 4 points. Total is a 12-point movement. Very significant. So the overall numbers for same-sex marriage, 42 to 40, essentially tied. So this is an issue that continues to divide the country, and it continues to be something that we should fight for. We have a lot of people on our side. Do not believe the media, the elites, that tell you this is a done deal, it's a settled law. It's not done, it's not settled, and we should fight it. Now, moving to some beliefs about marriage, 60% of actual voters, these were people who actually showed up and cast a ballot in 2012, believe that marriage is between one man and one woman only, 60%. That was in 2014, pardon me. 53% of voters believe that marriage is the union of a man and a woman. That was earlier this year in that same Family Research Council study. A majority of women say that the U.S. is worse off because of the declining marriage rates that we face. So the country is very much, up for grabs on marriage, and it continues to be. And there's some important findings there.
So Frank, why the difference? 60% believe.
It was actual voters versus people who were just registered to vote. So 60 and 53, and that's a reflection of the audience.
Right. So the apathetic are more, less opposed to same-sex marriage.
Right. And the unregistered voter is much more supportive of same-sex.
Okay, and that 42% paid, 40% paid,
right,
is everyone, all adults.
Yes. All right, so 58% of let's see, this voters, this must have been, yeah, this was voters. 58% of voters agree that marriage is a special relationship reserved for men and women because only the intimate union of men and women can produce children. 79% believe that marriage is more than just a commitment between two people, that it is created for the care and well-being of the next generation. 74% believe that marriage helps ensure that children will be known by and cared for by their parents. All of these things combined point in a real clear direction in my mind, and that is to talk about marriage in the context not of gays and lesbians per se, but in the context of children and what's best for kids and what contributes to their flourishing and their thriving, and why it's such an important thing that we get right as a society. In terms of religious liberty, some of this is related to the marriage issue. Let me first say that I've taken a look at religious liberty both in survey work and in focus groups. And people do not have a very good idea of what religious liberty means. They've heard the term. Some people know it's in the Constitution, not exactly sure where. A lot of people think it has something to do with separation of church and state, which is not in the Constitution. But they're hard-pressed to really understand what it means. And they tend to think of it as the right to believe what you want to believe. But of course, the Constitution doesn't guarantee the right to believe. The Constitution guarantees the right to exercise religion. And that's fundamentally what's at stake here today. So a specific example of this is in the wedding business. Nearly 60% of adults here believe that wedding-related businesses with religious objections should not be forced to perform a particular service. In that same poll, they asked people if there's a conflict between protecting religious liberty and protecting gay and lesbian rights, who should the government protect? And 56% said protect religious liberty. There are higher numbers related to this idea that a business should be able to refuse to perform a service that violates their conscience. I've seen that in several other polls. 41% of adults believe that religious freedom in the U.S. has grown worse in the past 10 years. About half agree that it's been restricted because groups are actively trying to move society away from Christian values. 30% say that the gay and lesbian community is the most active trying to remove Christian values from the country. Nearly 3/4, this is troubling, nearly 3/4 of adults say that no one set of values should dominate the country. Think about that.
Yeah, so 29%.
This is a country founded on religious liberty and Christian belief. There are differences. Yes, did you have a question before we move on?
I think I'll hold on.
Hold it? Okay. There are differences between practicing Christians and people who do not profess a faith, as you might expect. 52% of practicing Christians believe religious freedom in the U.S. has grown worse compared to 41% of the whole population, 52% of Christians, but only 32% of people with no faith have the same opinion. 49% of practicing Christians believe that gays and lesbians are the most active group trying to remove Christian values. Only 13% of people with no faith hold the same opinion. A little bit of info on millennials. So this is obviously an important audience. You know, the argument is we've lost the marriage issue with young people. They're strongly against us, which is not true. Yes, they are against us, but the big news to the media is that millennials grow up. People get older and their views change. They have kids. They realize this is not an academic discussion now. It's not a bumper strip. When their kid comes back from school and finds out that they can marry a person of the same sex because that's what they've been told, and this is a good thing, now all of a sudden it's a real issue in a family. All right, so 34% of millennials believe religious freedom has grown worse. That's compared to the 41% earlier. So less, but it's growing. It's up 9 points since 2012. So they're beginning to see it. This is an area that is very troubling. And it's a reflection, I think, of the culture and Hollywood and the media. So these were triadic focus groups that were conducted for the Heritage Foundation and Alliance Defending Freedom by a guy named D. Alsop, who's a good man, good Mormon, Heart and Mind Strategies, worked with Gary Lawrence and Richard Worthland back in the day. And so, again, these are 3 people focus groups, in-depth, somebody who is tends to be more pro-religious liberty, somebody tends to be not, and somebody in the middle. And so the result of these groups were that people understand what LGBT discrimination is, and they kind of define it as lack of social acceptance and bullying. And they think that's a very real deal. Very low awareness of religious freedom discrimination. And people are very hard-pressed to describe it. There's no question that momentum is on the side of the LGBT community. There's a perception that Christians have been on top for a long time, that LGBT discrimination has been going on for a long time, and they're the more sympathetic part. The reality, I think, is reflected reflective of exactly the opposite. That gays and lesbians have risen to almost a favored position in society. And people of faith are increasingly being discriminated against. And you see this widely throughout the marriage issue, but you see it in other contexts as well. Yes, ma'am.
So you don't have to answer this right now, but will you be talking about messaging to this particular group, age group? I mean to the millennials, as far as how do you message to that particular age group?
I don't have it as part of my presentation, but I'm happy to talk about it when we get to the descriptions. All right, so move to a different issue, physician-assisted suicide. Gallup reports 68% of Americans believe doctors should be allowed by law to assist a terminally ill patient commit suicide if the patient requests it. They looked at this actually in two different phrasing. One was euthanasia and one was suicide, and virtually no difference. Support for this is up 10 points in the last 10 years now. There's no question that the whole Brittany Maynard situation has driven a lot of that. Again, it's a story, very compelling one. The other side used to have Kevorkian, now they have Brittany Maynard, so they're on the rise. 56% believe that this is a morally acceptable behavior. Only 37% believe it's morally wrong. So this is an example of that right problem, wrong solution type situation that I described earlier. You know, going headlong into a campaign arguing the morality of physician-assisted suicide is probably not going to be successful. There was an actual campaign on this issue in Massachusetts, an extraordinarily liberal state, as bad as California certainly, maybe worse, on physician-assisted suicide in 2012. And they had data that was much similar to this national data. So support for the idea of the legislation that was passed by the Massachusetts Legislative Assembly was, you know, near 70%, maybe over it. But what they found was, and what they focused on, were 5 elements that are factors in the Oregon and Vermont laws, and were factors in Massachusetts. And those are these. There was no psychological evaluation required of a patient. And think about that. You know, if you're somebody who's terminally ill, deeply depressed, and there's no psychological evaluation at all, no witness required to be present, no trained medical person required to be present, the patient not required to notify a family member. So this all happens in the dark. And the fact that the lethal prescription could be picked up at the Rite Aid or CVS pharmacy. So literally go in and get 100 pills a second off. That's the law. And so they were able to defeat that law and overturn it by focusing on these key elements. Move on to family structure. And so I'm going to just open it with this question. I found this to be fascinating. What do you think is the #1 predictor of child poverty? Is it racial composition, educational attainment, or the percent of families headed by married parents?
Yeah, marriage.
Married parents. Well, of course, you saw Brad Wilcox.
Yep.
You had the advantage. So it is the percent of families headed by married parents. I think this is really the key to re-engaging the marriage issue, is to show this enormously important institution's contributions to human flourishing, happy families, the children's well-being. Yes.
I understood on that, though, there was a lot of focus testing done on that, and the children question, which I thought was the premier in the same-sex marriage debate, was the debate.
Right.
It did not test well.
No, it
People
doesn't.
didn't- Yeah, so why would that work when it hasn't tested well?
Well, it has to.
Focus on the children need a mother and a father argument.
Well, it doesn't test well because it's tested in the context of you know, gays and lesbians, not in the context of kids generally. Okay, so it's perceived in if you get into focus groups and you're talking about gay marriage, is perceived as you're being anti-gay. That you're saying they're not going to be a good parent, that they don't love their children. That's the way it's perceived. And that's what I'm saying is take that out. Forget about gays and lesbians for now.
So you're saying that's already decided, so it's gone already?
No, I'm not saying it's gone. I'm saying focus on the importance to children of a mother and a father. And it crosses so many different areas. Poverty. What's that?
Oh, I don't see any difference in it. I mean, if people aren't focused on children, which evidently they weren't with the same-sex marriage question, why would they suddenly begin to care about just only in the economic sense of poverty?
No, there's many outcome indicators. I mean, mental health, physical health,
Right, but
educational.
why would suddenly people start to care?
Well, because they care about the kids. You know, that's where you've got to
But they don't
start.
care about the kids. in
You
regard
got to
to
rebuild
gays.
a marriage culture.
No, they're more concerned about the stigma of gay marriage. When you're asking about gay marriage, that's what they're concerned about. When
Right.
you're asking about children, that's what they're concerned about.
Okay.
Yeah, reading the story.
Yes, in the
Do you mean like the formation of how you go about asking these questions? So if you're talking about children first, sort of like you were saying earlier, the leading questions, you know, if you're leading into things, talking about children first and the needs of children, then if sometime later and you kind of bring in the LGBT thing, then you might get more favorable responses.
Well, we actually got favorable responses by even with a lot of discussion about gays and lesbians in the survey about children deserve the love of a mother and a father. We got strong responses to that. And we got strong responses by voters whenever we did advertising that talked about kids, especially in the educational environment, you know, the books that are read to them at school and the rest of it. So, you know, I don't necessarily agree that you don't get a good response. But what I'm saying is we can eliminate a lot of the pushback and some of the emotional reaction by not even getting into a discussion about gays and lesbians. Just talk about family structure, how important it is. It's implied, obviously, but it's not a full frontal attack. You see what I'm saying?
That's the interesting thing. In New Zealand we had the same thing, that the focus of marriage was the rights of adults. So the focus was on adults that are missing out. Whereas in poverty, in New Zealand it's always termed, it's not poverty, or family poverty, it's child poverty. They always call it child poverty. So I think we should springboard on that, and it makes us realise that in a lot of these debates we need to come in from the child focus, because that's very powerful and emotive.
Right. So you saw some of this earlier. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It's having married parents in the home is the strongest predictor of upward mobility. Cohabitation, which is on the rise, is a very poor substitute for marriage. It's not the same as marriage. It results in more divorce when they do get married, but researchers term it the fragile family. They just don't last very long. Half of couples who cohabitate at a child's birth will be split up by the time the child is 5. And then we get into repartnering, serial cohabitation, lots of blended family issues, and that leads to instability. Family structure does matter to voters. I've tested this in a number of different ways. On a national survey, 2/3 of U.S. voters were concerned about the unintended consequences of same-sex households. What I meant by that is when you go through the outcome differences that were identified in the Regnero study of 2012, and there are lots of them, people are concerned about that. It's a hard issue to argue because you get right into this notion of gays and lesbians aren't good parents. That's not what we're saying. I don't believe that to be true, and I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that children do thrive when they're raised by a married mother and a father, and that's a good thing to talk about. So the Regnero study that's called a New Family Structure Study, if you haven't looked at it and you're interested in these issues, it's available online. Did show widespread negative outcomes for kids raised by a parent who had interested in a same-sex relationship. Across almost every way of looking at it. Emotional health, mental health, suicide ideation, physical health, educational attainment, delinquency, criminality, have been the victim of abuse themselves. So there's lots of important things out there. We certainly should not be encouraging more kids to be raised in this kind of situation. The evidence is pretty clear now that it's not good. There was a study, very large study done out of Canada by Douglas Allen, who took a look at the Canadian census, and in the Canadian census they asked very specific information, so we know a lot more about people in Canada than we do in the US. And children of gay and lesbian parents are only 65% as likely to graduate from high school as compared to those who are raised by married opposite-sex parents. And girls are particularly impacted. Only 15% of girls are as likely to graduate from high school. That's not a good outcome. There was a study here recently, this year, published, it was actually published in the British Journal of Education, Science and Behavioral Science. But it was a study of US National Health Interview Survey data. And again, looked at the differences between kids raised in a same-sex household and kids raised in an opposite-sex household. And this was a fairly large survey. It was like over 500, similar to the Regero study of 2012. And they found that emotional problems were over twice as prevalent for kids raised by a same-sex parent. 17% of them had serious problems compared with only 7% among opposite-sex parents. Rates of ADHD were double. Same is true of learning disabilities. So lots of more growing data on this.
Just on that, Frank, and if you actually talk about opposite sex married parents, the discrepancy is fourfold.
Okay.
So children of same-sex couples have a fourfold increase in serious emotional psychological problems versus married heterosexual, and if they are married, it's twice.
So here are some quotes here that might be useful. The joint biological parentage, the modal condition for opposite-sex parents, and not possible for same-sex parents, sharply differentiates between the two groups on child emotional problem outcomes. Quote, published research employing the new family structure study, the early childhood longitudinal study, the U.S. Census, Canadian Census, and now the National Health Survey all reveal a comparable basic narrative, namely that children who grow up with a married mother and a father fare best. And finally, 3 new pieces of scholarship, a journal, a report, and a study were released this month that solidify the growing scientific consensus that marriage and family structure matter for children, families, and the nation as a whole. I just believe that in the environment that we are, we have to start where people are, and that is that they do understand the importance of a mother and a father, and that they are can be engaged in that way. So here's the changing moral landscape. The effects of the LGBT population are somewhere in the 1% to 3% range. Okay? I can't tell you how many TV shows there are about transgender people, but that's something like 2% of the LGBT population, something like that. It's minuscule. You could never survey them, they're so small in the universe. Anyway, because of the way Hollywood portrays them, Americans currently believe that 25% of the population is lesbian, gay, or transgender. It's unbelievable. 30% of adults under age 60 report having had overlapping sexual relationships in their lives. 44% say that living together before marriage is a good idea. 36% say it's okay for people to have sex without expecting anything further. 28% say parents should stay together for the sake of kids. 40% disagree with that. And then, and that was all from the
I have a question actually.
study. Yeah. You had a question?
I just want to make a comment. You mentioned Hollywood,
Relationships and
but as an educator, our children are getting across the nation, middle school, high school, elementary, the LGBTQ, GLSEN, safe space thing is priming them for this.
Yes.
So I just want to point that out. Hollywood
Absolutely.
definitely helps, but we're getting it inundated in schools.
Totally. In California, this was a few years ago too, this was mind-boggling. In a kindergarten class, these kids were asked to sign a card pledging to be an ally of the LGBTQ community.
Where was
They
this?
can't even sign their name. They have no idea what LGBT means, and they're 5 years old.
The schools have been hijacked with this. I just want you to know that in Hollywood, and this is definitely a big push.
Yes, and
On the previous page, it said overlapping sexual relationships.
right, so
What's that?
having sex with two people at the same time.
Cheating.
Oh.
So,
Not necessarily.
not in the same room, not not a threesome, at least, you know, it used to be that you shouldn't have sex until you're married, right? And then we moved to, well, you can have sex outside of marriage, that's okay. Now we're at a position where you can have sex with multiple different people together, no big deal. All right, just a couple of final things. There's no question that attitudes on these types of issues are moving to the left. The largest shift, of course, has been related to gay and lesbian issues. Yet, despite the shift, 72% of Americans say that the state of moral values is getting worse in the U.S. It's not getting better. And that was a report that the head of Gallup wrote. So that's encouraging. If you need me for any reason, my email address is here. It's frank@missionpublicaffairs.com. And I'll get that up. Yes?
Do you know if there's been any studies on, like you gave a lot of statistics of people, how many people support same-sex marriage, for example?
Right.
I'm curious about studies that find out if people's opinions change when they find they have a son or daughter, niece, nephew, sister that comes out. What's the percentage of people who change their opinion because now it's come home to them?
I don't know. A very large percentage of people already have somebody that they know or is in their family who's gay or lesbian, about 3/4. So I'm not sure I've seen anything about attitudes changing after they come out. But I assume that they do. I mean,
to me, that feels like the biggest stumbling block on this issue, because people who you know well, who you think will be on the same side of the issue as you, end up being on the other side of the issue. And I don't know how many of you, for example, I had so many people come to me the day of the SCOTUS decision and tell me how shocked they were at how many friends, Facebook friends, colored their pictures rainbow in support of the decision, and they were just shocked. I had no idea that one of my friends would ever be in support of that. It was really eye-opening to people.
But they also did a study on how many dropped it and how quickly they dropped it too.
Oh, really?
Dropped what?
Dropped the rainbow, got rid of the rainbow feature. It's hard to find.
A question, Frank, on the issue of marriage, could I ask, what would you say is the strongest message that we could use, and also who should we target? Under 40s, over 40s, people in church, women who are, at least in Australia, I understand, are a bit soft on the issue for some reason.
well, you've got the plebiscite coming up,
Yep.
right? So
Yep.
you should target the people most likely to turn out for that in terms of who's going to make up the voting population.
In Australia, it's compulsory to.
Yeah, it's compulsory.
Yeah.
Well, it has to, everybody shows up then.
Yeah. Well, no, but
Not necessarily the plebiscite, but certainly referendums and elections, it's compulsory voting. We're happy the plebiscite would be compulsory, otherwise we probably have already lost. I mean, Ireland only had a 60% turnout, and that was a contributing factor to their loss.
so, yeah. So what message?
Well,
do
the
you
best
give?
messages that we found continue to be the consequence messages. So it's a similar technique of the right problem, wrong solution type deal, which is to talk about the outcomes. You know, it's bad. It's going to be a bad deal for kids. You're going to lose control of how your children are taught in school. People of faith will be targeted. You know, you talk about all the things that are going on out there, and also talk about, in my view, this whole track of the importance of mothers and fathers. And what we should be doing is spending time promoting marriage, the reality of marriage, and the benefits to kids and to couples when we focus on marriage. I think those are the most promising areas of inquiry.
Thank you.
Just for interest of some other people, hear that conflict between the benefits, you know, the rights of the child and mum and a dad, and let gay couples be happy. In our research in Australia a couple of months ago, we, I think for the first time, put those two priorities head to head. We got a 76% of people said yes, where possible, children should be raised by their mum and dad, fine. A similar number said, oh yes, you know, in the previous study, gay couples should be free to marry. And we said to them, given that these two are incompatible, given that if you want a child to have a mum and a dad, you can't support two-man marriage. It's not possible. Okay? Which of these is more important? The right of children to have a mum and dad, or the right of two men to marry and start a family? We've got a 3-to-1 majority for the child. But we also got a third of people who said, I still want both. So there's the confusion.
I want to go to Disneyland.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you know anything about how just promoting the dream that I think most people still have, young people, I'm going to get married, I'm going to have a family, I'm going to do these things. How would that play with young people? Because it seems to me that we don't just, you were kind of saying emphasize the benefits to children of a mom and dad, but young people dream of finding that perfect person and getting married and having kids. I feel like that's the message we need to send to win their hearts, that yeah, you're going to be so happy, you're going to love it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't think there's exclusionary or competing, but yeah, I think so.
For the most part, though, the surveys show that they want to be married. It's the journey there that we get way like misconceptions of it.
Right.
So.
Right. No, I think you're on to that. Yes.
Something that I've been trying to reframe and revision for years is the term abstinence. That word is polarizing. It might as well be thrown away because if you say it creates huge issues. So help me, I consider even having a contest to come up with a new word for abstinence, chastity, that don't carry the connotations, the religious baggage, but yet communicate the message. We've seen the industry go to sexual risk avoidance, which is too clinical. We need a word. We need a phrase. What is it? The purity? No, it's too connected to chastity. Yeah, it's way too tied to that. There's got to be a word.
Is faithfulness?
What is it?
Faithfulness? Because that implies nothing happens until it's a faithful context.
That includes definition.
Maybe exclusivity.
Yeah, I don't know. I was hoping you or someone.
I'll have to think about it.
Yeah, because it's a huge need, because the schools are being taken over through the comprehensive sex ed meme. Our opposition grabbed that word comprehensive, which has been a gold mine for it. Makes the rest of us look like Neanderthals and don't want to tell children anything because they're teaching comprehensive sex ed, and we're the abstinence folks, which has this negative connotation to it. gotta have some new words, I don't know what they are.
See, like this. How about the word that they like?
What means don't have sex out of marriage? That's what we're looking for.
Well, I mean, you know, we've got, one of the problems is that people today, especially young people, are loath to have any judgment about anything. They don't want to judge everybody. You know, they think judgment is mean. So it's, you know, that makes it tough. Yes.
Can we go back to the child? Because we've heard a lot of statistics about how young girls are damaged by these casual relationships they're having because they're not being abstinent.
Right.
Can we go back to that girl, to that young girl, and how she's being used, abused, and becomes psychologically and emotionally a mess?
Absolutely.
And then she can't have successful marriages, and the boy can't have successful marriages because he's warped his view of what
plays
sexual relationships are.
Which is good, and we've seen it in the anti-porn movement in the last year.
Yeah.
They finally rebranded and repackaged to a public health model.
Right.
Just like with this, taking their cues from the smoking situation. Talk about it from a public health perspective, what it does to children, what it does to men, what it does to women. So
I think all of that plays out in the campaign, but I, you know,
I don't
how
think
do
we
you
want
describe
to.
it?
I don't know if we want to say comprehensive sex ed, but comprehensive sex ed is permission for boys to use girls. That's what it is.
Well, it's
to use and abuse girls. That's permission.
LGBT propaganda.
I did some focus groups. This was fascinating with at Princeton University, and we did them specifically on the hookup culture. So we had a focus group of male students and a separate one of female students. We had a female woman, a female moderator. She did a great job, and it was stunning. I mean, these are some of the brightest kids in America, and they are living a sad life. Neither boys or girls are happy about it. You know, the expectation is they're just going to go and meet up, get hammered, and have sex. That's the extent of the relationship. And they might even get a girl that gets asked out on a date with a text message. That's the extent of the intimacy that some of these kids are experiencing in colleges. So I think there's a lot to play into. Is this all there is? Aren't you better than this? Aren't you worth more than this? Aren't you more valuable, you know, than because you have a particular body part that somebody wants?
In fact, just one more insight for this lady on that question. When I speak to senior high school boys in Australia, just on the faithfulness idea, when I speak to senior high school boys in Australia, I say to them, unless you are prepared to be loyal to your partner and to any child you might create, don't even go near any sexual relationship. That's the idea of faithfulness. And if you use the word faithfulness, it implies a certain context where there can't be a sexual relationship unless there's the loyalty between the partners.
Faithfulness, education?
Yeah, faithfulness, sex education. Don't know. Just a thought.
Yeah,
You might,
yeah.
or sex in context. Sex in context. Then you're allowed to shape what you mean by that. But faithfulness is quite...
It's got a ring to it, sex in context.
I know we have to keep the message simple, but would it be too complicated to state the fact that not all homosexuals think alike? In Canada, when we fought against the redefinition of marriage, there were many prominent homosexuals, editors of homosexual magazines who were opposed to marriage.
Right.
And there were many academics who were homosexual and came forward. They didn't get much publicity in the media.
Right.
But there's a division there. They don't all think alike.
Right.
And another thing, after we had a census, after we have them every 4 years, after same-sex marriage was legalized, the redefinition of marriage, and there's a great difference between the male couples and the female couples in terms of their behavior, in terms of whether they have children or not. Would it be too complicated just to confuse the issue and then throw these facts out to tell people that when you're talking about same-sex marriage, you're talking about different things.
Right.
You're lumping all different groups together and different opinions and beliefs about what marriage is and whether they want marriage or not. And I think in Canada, there weren't that many homosexuals who accepted, who went into marriage.
Right. No, this is all true, and there's lots of evidence out there to point to in terms of the different type of relationship. You know, the loving, committed gay relationship, especially among men, is not remotely resembling a married relationship.
Yeah, it's
Almost
hard to get
all
across.
of them have sex on the side. Yeah, almost all. You know, that's what commitment is. Lesbians tend to be more committed. They tend to have an exclusive relationship, but they are very short-lasting relationships. Serial type situation.
Any thoughts on messaging to politicians, particularly if you're trying to shape the question of a plebiscite?
Well, sure. A politician is really only motivated by how's it going to impact their next election, right? So you've got to show them that people are with them if they do the right thing, and they'll punish them if they do the right thing. One of the things that the National Organization for Marriage, with whom I do a lot of work, has been very successful at is trying to keep the base of the Republican Party engaged in the marriage issue. And they've done that through helping to elect people on marriage and to help defeat people. Last cycle, there were 4 races, 2 U.S. House races, where pro-gay marriage Republicans were running. One of them was actually gay himself. First TV commercial I had, he and his partner at the Gay Pride Parade, this is a Republican. And NOM helped defeat both of those. They helped elect 2 U.S. Senate candidates with independent expenditures, making marriage an issue. We hope to do that in the presidential race this year as well. So those are very effective techniques that work with politicians. You've got to get the grassroots engaged as well in contacting them so that they hear it. Because otherwise, all they see is, you know, what everybody sees, which is a pro-gay message on TV and in the news constantly.
Thank you.
So how do you, as a millennial, how would you message to millennials, especially about all of them?
Well, I think you have to have an aspirational message. You know,
Yeah.
the marriage is a beautiful thing. It's something to strive for. It will make your life better. It's essential for your children's future. And when we redefine marriage, as we've done, it's going to have widespread negative consequences for you and your family. People have this idea that gay marriage exists alongside traditional marriage. It's just a different expression of the same thing. But that's not the way it works. There is only one kind of marriage now in the United States. It's a genderless, genderless marriage. That's it. That's what everybody has. So you cannot think about or act on the idea that marriage is the union of a man and a woman, because that is against the law. That's why we have these legal conflicts. That's why, so many, we're going to have all kinds of them over the next few years. Because it's actually not what the law provides. The law provides that any 2 people can get married if they're an adult.
I just really see that focus on the children and the impact on children being huge, especially what you see that the schools have been hijacked with this message that kids are all prime.
Right.
If they, I think it would resonate on, taking care of the children and protecting them. You've got sex trafficking, you've got kids step up to that.
Right.
That you're affecting a child. That might be my brother, my sister. The marriage thing, I don't know. I mean, that argument with millennials, I think it's lost. I mean, I'm not, I don't think we should keep fighting, but I just think that child, I think that's huge, right?
I mean, what happens, I think, probably what will happen, I'm projecting, but, it's going to take a long while. There's going to have to be a number of years of experience with this and see a lot of broken kids, a lot of broken families, a lot of bad outcomes.
And I would just say the reason I say that in Oregon, we had a success story, well, we don't go into it, but we kept bringing it back to the rights of parents. And you have legislators, you have school board members, you have media, people could argue against that.
Right.
People can't really argue against wanting to protect these precious little children or minors.
Right.
So I think there could be a lot of potential there.
So just on that general theme, especially at the schools, I agree completely with you, they've been hijacked. But there's got to be, you've got to fight back. You've got to get parents organized and say, we're not going to take this. This is not acceptable. And go to the meetings and kick these people out of office and elect people who will stand with you. Yes.
So my question, a lot of your statistics seem to show that there's a lot of people who just don't know what's really going on.
Yes.
And those are the people who don't go and vote, or they're apathetic about it. So what is your best suggestion? If that's my target group, people who don't know and need to be informed, and then they will come over to my point of view, what is your best suggestion for reaching that target audience?
Well, the best thing would be a sustained, funded campaign. You know, social media, advertising, over a long period of time to talk to them.
Isn't that what hasn't been working though?
No, it hasn't been done. The only time we ever talk about these issues in public is when it's on the ballot in the context of a, gay marriage.
We're not
I'm
starting.
talking about a long,
We're not
ongoing.
starting soon enough. We're waiting till it becomes an issue instead of educating people now.
Right. I mean, it's gotta change. We've got to talk about it. The pastors have to start talking about it. They're terrible. They're afraid. And I'm not picking on any particular religion. I'm just saying, as a general matter, our faith leaders have done a lousy job. We need to have nonprofit groups be funded who can start to do this ongoing education work. That's really the solution at the end
Our
of the day.
churches are really strangled by their tax-free status.
Well, but
They're afraid if they start getting political, the IRS will
But
come after
there's
them.
nothing political about talking about marriage.
It's doctrine. It's
And
doctrine, but not according to the IRS.
Well, the issue's been decided, that makes it less political.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've spent a lot of time with lawyers, a lot of time with pastors. I know probably more about this I ever dreamed I would know. But there's absolutely no tax reason, none, that a pastor at a church, a nonprofit group, a charity could not spend all of its money, if it wanted to, on education about marriage and the importance of marriage. I'm not talking about casting a vote for a particular side or a candidate. I'm just saying that education is decided on this.
To get your slides, do we email you or do we?
Yeah, just email me and I'll be happy to send them to you.
Frank, you talked earlier in the presentation about challenging their language.
Right.
And an example would be that the other side calls themselves progressives, the media calls them progressives, which by inference means that we're traditionalists, we're from the last century, we're archaic in our views, and we're not up with the times. So we need to challenge that language rather than accept it. We shouldn't let ourselves be typecast as traditionalists.
Absolutely.
What better message and what better names can we give to them and to us?
Well, we could call ourselves progressive as well. It's progressive to want to help lift families out of poverty. It's progressive to help children overcome problems that they may have because of their family structure. It's progressive to give people, the right values, those kinds of things.
So if one of an advocate for the natural family, for annual marriage has been interviewed in Australia, for instance, where that's still the law of the land, and the media interview talks about progressives, then that person on our side should say, well, hang on, not all change is progress. Some change is retrogressive, and call them on that. But what I'm wondering is, if both sides call ourselves progressives, it's going to confuse the issue. Can we find a better name for them and a better name for us?
Probably so. I don't know what it is off the top of my head. Yes, and that.
My thought about that is that sometimes we get so divisive about names and labels when really we're more unified on some of our desires, right? Most of us do want good outcomes for children, and we disagree about how to get there, and we disagree about, you know, marriage or the definition of marriage, and those are important to discuss too, but I think if we can start with common ground and not necessarily wait for the pastors. You can encourage the pastors, but why not have a reading group, right? Invite 5 to 12 of your friends or neighbors for 6 weeks to have an hour-and-a-half session where you read and discuss or watch and discuss, you know, some movie or article, and have it be structured and bring treats and make it short and sweet, right?
Yeah.
We all can do that from grassroots.
No, that's a great suggestion. We're working with NOM on a 6-part grassroots program that walks people through some of these issues, the complementarity and has a small group discussion exactly for that reason.
I was just going to say, I would also be eyes and ears wherever you are, and encourage people to be eyes and ears. And when you see something in your school system or whatever that is driving a child towards that potential demise, to bring it up before the school board, bring it up before the superintendent who wants to be hired again, school boards want to be elected again, and just bring it to their attention. It's pretty powerful. But the eyes and ears, and read, of course.
And video everything. If you don't video it, it didn't happen.
Exactly.
Frank, how do you determine who the swinging voters are in a same-sex marriage campaign?
Well, that's a term kind of called the mushy middle. You know, they essentially identify themselves, you know, if they are undecided, are primarily those people, or who they're soft on the issue. You know, typically we'll ask, do you strongly favor, somewhat favor? So it's in the somewhat neutral and somewhat opposed category.
And then what, break them up into gender and demographics, and then if the question is then, does that then enable you to target messages to them? Is the research usually good enough to tell you on which things they're more mushy or more vulnerable?
It should be. I mean, it depends on the sample size and some other things, but you also have to make a judgment on is that the best use of your resources? Are they really likely to show up? And of course, in your case, everybody's going to show up, so it would be worthwhile.
One of your first slides was slogans that the other side uses.
Yeah.
And to me, this is the biggest problem, because the progressive issues all will narrow down into one short 3-word slogan, and conservative principles don't narrow down so easily. They take a little more explanation to make people understand the principle. So can you give us some ideas, some examples of things we can turn into slogans?
Well, this goes with your question. Is there a process when you're trying to come up with a slogan or frame a message, something? Do you sit down with a group of people and just start bouncing ideas?
Yes,
what is the process?
That's typically what I'll do, is get a group of people together and creative people and start working through concepts, and we'll have sheets all the way around the room by the time we're done with it and start to narrow it down. But an example would be that I like is "Life, what a beautiful choice."